Good evening, everyone. The observant amongst you will have noticed that I'm not Harry, who normally introduces these talks. As tonight's talk is titled Speed Queens, it's all about the ladies, so he's asked me to introduce tonight's speaker for you. Most of you will know me from the back of my head, because I'm normally behind that camera there filming the events. Some of you may have met me when I gave a talk here myself a few years ago, or you might know me from my role on the committee here. I've been a member at Brooklands for some years, and if any of you aren't members, you can visit the outreach stand at the back there and sign up. Got the plug in, Harry? This is a time of the evening when Harry normally asks anyone who's not come in from the bar to come and take their seats, but you're all very well behaved tonight. So, as I say, when I first came to Brooklands many years ago, I remember clearly visiting the Barbara Cartland room downstairs and reading about all the ladies like Petre who used to race at Brooklands and thinking, wow, there was more women involved in motorsport back then when I was growing up. So, and I think it's those stories about the drivers who raced here that really bring a place to life. So really looking forward to hearing from tonight's speaker, Rachel Harris-Gardiner, who motoring journalist and author, who knows everything there is to know about women racing drivers, I'm told. Hands up any ladies in the room here that race. Lorena, come on. We've got the president of the British Women Racing Drivers Club in here, and she's being shy. And I happen to know that Rachel also does her PR, so without further ado, I'd rather hear from Rachel. Come and join us. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks for the welcome. I'm Rachel Harris-Gardiner, author of, oh, it's not there, so I'm a little bit, yes. Oh, okay, thank you. Right, get started properly now. So I wrote a book called Speed Queens, which I was fortunate enough to win the RAC's Motorsport Book of the Year award last year, which was an amazing honour for my first book. And I thought it was only there to put my teeth in. This always happens. I'm not used to talking on a microphone. I thought I was only there to make up the numbers, but it seems that there was more of an appetite for people wanting to know about the female side of motorsport than maybe we thought. So how far back to begin? That's always the problem when you start writing a book. It's like, well, where's the beginning? It's sometimes more difficult to find where to start than to where to end. So I kept looking back through newspaper reports and through things that were written, and at the moment, the earliest I can find is 1897, and this was the Championnat des Chauffeurs, which was held in Paris at the Longchamp racecourse, and it was quite an odd event. It was for three-wheeled vehicles. Excuse me. It wasn't strictly a sporting event. It was part of an event called the Course des Artistes, which was quite a modern idea. It was a celebrity sports day, and the first women to race on motorised transport that we know of, there may be some earlier ones. It would be amazing if I did find out there were some early ones, but so far were a group of French music hall actresses and other theatrical ladies who, it was, I think, 3 heats of a single lap and a final of 2 laps on the Dion motorised tricycles, which it must have been very comical because they go at a sort of jogging pace. They make quite a strange noise, and they'll be ridden by ladies in Victorian skirts. Apparently only Lella Lombardi, who was a costume designer, she wasn't actually an actress, was the winner. and she was the only one described as wearing a hat, which must have been a bit scandalous. So she was sort of trumping around a horse racing course on a tricycle, not going very fast, but we have to remember that the men that were racing various vehicles, and there was quite a few bicycle races as well, weren't going very fast either, so it would have been exciting, but it would have been comical at the same time. They loved this sort of thing in France. It carried on. There was another event in 1898, which was won by Lella Lombardi again. She also won one of the cycling races and a race for women on tandems with Madame de Grandval, who also raced tricycles. I think it was the following year, 1899, she also won the roller skating race. So we think of motorsport now as being this very serious pursuit done by sort of young, square-faced, very serious, athletic men, taking things very seriously in cars that are created by very serious, square-faced engineers. But it's not always been the case. There's always, at the very beginning of motorsport, I mean, 1897 was only 3 years after the first official motor race happened. So there was only really 3 years where women didn't take part at all, which is an interesting concept. We were all of motorsport was deciding, who does this belong to? It hasn't always been this very manly pursuit. It had all kinds of sides at the beginning when it was a new technology and new sport and pastime, and it's like, right, well, who's this for? There were all sorts of people jockeying for position. You had celebrity sports days involving trumping tricycles going around horse racing tracks. And you had sort of garden party type events that you had things like a waistcoat race, which was, this is for gentlemen, jump on your tricycle, go to the post at the other end of the course, take the waistcoat, put it on, come back. And that was even in the UK. That was 1900 at the Rainley Club, and that was the earliest women's race that I've come across in the UK. Sorry, where was I? Yes, earliest, and that took place at a polo club, and it was this sort of very jolly fete atmosphere. It was won by a lady called Miss Weblin, who not sure what her first name was. It may have been Gladys, but it may have been Theodora. I think it's Theodora. Other people think it was Gladys. They were two sisters, and she was on racing a Daimler. And as far as I know, that is actually the first circuit race that was ever held in the UK. It was obviously not on a permanent circuit because there weren't any and they'd only just been invented, but it was a set-out course on a polo pitch. So I think the first ever circuit race in the UK was contested by 4 women for society ladies at a jolly gymkhana at the Rainley Club in Barnes in London. Things do get serious quite quickly, though. A lot of you have probably heard of this rather charming lady in bloomers here, very tiny waist. That I think that's early photoshopping going on there. It happened all the time. This was Camille Dugast. She was a French woman. She was a wealthy widow who'd become a widow at a very early age. And her husband had been the heir to the Dufayel department store for fortune. She'd done all sorts of exciting things already. She'd jumped out of balloons with a parachute, which was sort of more like a giant umbrella with a trapeze on that you sort of sat on and hung onto. It was all very precarious. And she did it under her own name so that she wouldn't be accused of favouritism or that sort of nepotism type thing. She first raced in 1901, and I assume that she will have mucked about in some motor gymkhanas or gone trumping around Longchamp on a tricycle. But she went for the big one. She went for the Paris-Berlin cross-country race, which she was the only woman to enter. It was like, well, should we let women enter? And there hadn't been any before, so there were just no rules about them, really. And it was like, well, there's nothing in the rules that say women can't enter, so we can't really get rid of her. So she was allowed to take part. And this is her in a car. This was originally captioned as being Brighton in 1905, but it's not Brighton in 1905 because she wasn't there. I will jump in because it's going to pop up again and again. When you're looking at the history of women in motorsport, there are just so many legends and odd stories that just aren't true. Or they're sort of true, but they've been twisted over time. And it's nice to acknowledge them because they're good fun. But a lot of the time I found that I can't really say the truth because I wasn't there, but what really happened or what was reported at the time was something rather different. And Camille was one of those, but she was one of those attention-grabbing people that stories about her just did go crazy in the press. In 1903, she entered the Paris to Madrid race, which got named the race to death. They stopped it at Bordeaux because there had been too many accidents. And she'd already stopped to rescue her teammate Phil Stead from underneath a crashed car. So everything she said and did got kind of blown out of proportion. But it is important to note she was quite a big media star at the time. She was sort of a sideshow, but she wasn't a minor figure. People liked her. People might have disliked her, but in the very least they found her interesting. And that's something that I've come across again and again and again, that now we think of women as these little oddities that pop up now and again, and it's just not true. When I was writing the book, I was trying to explain to someone what it's like when you start delving into the history. And if you imagine that you've got a jigsaw puzzle in front of you with a box the picture's on the box and it's a bit faded, and just say, this is the picture, maybe. And you start doing the jigsaw puzzle and you realise that there's far more to the picture than what it looks like on the box. That there's all sorts of characters in the background and clues to when the picture was done, and just all this other information that perhaps wouldn't have been there if you'd have just looked at the picture on the box. And that's what it feels like researching this subject. I mean, some people have said, well, but motorsport's full of men, why are you ignoring them? Why are you just putting women to the front? And that's not what I'm doing at all. If you imagine, well, it's a big picture with lots of faces, and all the men are on there, on the big picture that we see everywhere. But all I'm doing is giving the picture a bit of a wipe, so we see the women popping out, and also other groups of people that would. One of these would be Dorothy Levitt. This is our first connection with Brooklands. Dorothy raced for the Napier Motor Company between 1903 and 1908 in big Napier motor cars, as in the Napier that this room's named after, and also in a small Dion, which she used for long-distance trials. She raced a Gladiator because they were imported by SF Edge, who also imported Napier and was the agent for Napier in the UK. She is just one of the best examples of legends and stories that spring up about female drivers. Some of them are true. She may well have invented the rearview mirror. She wrote a book in 1909 where she recommends that you carry quite a large hand mirror in the drawer under the seat so you can hold it up and see what's behind you. So that's the first recorded use for the rearview mirror. There were other things about her that weren't true, though. She claimed that she'd grown up in the West Country, that she gained her love for speed from riding horses and following the hunt, that she loved fishing. She gave this impression of being a sort of landed gentry lady. She also claimed that she'd run away and escaped an arranged marriage, and that's how she met a mysterious friend who gave her a car and realised that she was this amazing driver, and that's how her career started. The most interesting thing about these legends is that she actually started them all herself. We're going to encounter a few fibbers in the course of this talk. I don't mind fibbers if they're entertaining fibbers. She was very entertaining. She was actually a Jewish woman from East London. I mean, it's not a rags to riches story. She was from quite a well-off family that were in the jewellery business. Father was a very wealthy diamond dealer, but she wasn't landed gentry. She was in trade and she was Jewish. She wasn't sort of quite you, as Nancy Mitford would call it. So she just pretended she was. And it worked. She was a massive star. I mean, the stories helped, but you go on a newspaper archive and put her name in, and there's syndicated stories about that, I don't know, she just turned up at South Harting Hill Climb and finished 5th, but they'd be talking about what she'd been wearing, who she was with, who she seemed to be supporting. She was definitely not an ephemeral figure. She was a very famous personality. She was actually pretty good as well. She won a match race at the 1905 Brighton Speed Trials. It was a Daily Mail challenge. She won some money racing against men in a big, it always sounds like a big beastly Napier. It only got 90 horsepower, which is probably about the same as our Volkswagen Polo has, but it was pretty impressive at the time. And it was considered quite a difficult car for a woman to handle. And she did, even the year before in 1904, where she disappeared from view a bit for 9 months, which I think is quite a suspicious length of time. And she said, oh yes, I like a small car. I would never drive one of those big cars. Can't do it. Too physical. And of course she did do it, and everyone just loved her the more for it. You'll recognise the view behind Dorothy just there. She's sitting in a stripped down Napier, and that's actually a Napier racing uniform she's wearing. She wrote quite extensively about what women should wear to drive, and it normally involved a duster coat and a hat, and she hasn't got either of those on. She's wearing a jumper. I mean, when I first encountered this picture, I assumed that it had been taken much later in the 1920s when knitwear for women became a thing. But it's not. It's from 1908, I think, and she is just posing for a picture, but she's dressed to race. She's there to take a chance. This brings us on to one of the other sort of misconceptions that we get on this subject, that women were actually banned from competing. We've already said between 1894 and 1897, no women competed, but that wasn't because they were banned particularly. It was just they didn't, or if they did, we don't know about it yet. It'd be amazing to find out if some did. There were just so few cars to race and so few racing drivers that none of them happened to be women. There was no specific prohibition. At this hallowed place, the organising club weren't actually that keen on women racing. There was the justification given was that the club had been founded on the same principles as the jockey club, and the jockey club didn't allow women, so that was that. Dorothy did try and enter one of the first events ever held here, but her entry wasn't accepted, and she was the car entrant with a man driving her car. And her team colours were white with a green stripe on the sleeves, I think. But that's not even the full story, because there were lots of clubs that had events at Brooklands, and not all of them it didn't include women. We have, I think this is Muriel Thompson out in front, sitting very upright, and I think the lady in the car to the rear is Christabel Ellis. And this was 1908, and it was one of the only official BARC races for women held until the 1920s. This was the ladies' bracelet handicap, which Muriel won in an Austin called Pobble, and it was actually Ethel Lock-King who was second in a Itala Bambo, and Christabel had been further at the order, as she was here just behind Muriel in an Arrow Johnson that was the Guarded Flame. And this is always said, oh yeah, there were only two events for women before the 1920s. There was this one, and then these two women faced off against each other for a match race. But that's not quite true. Muriel Thompson, Pobble was her brother's car, but she raced it quite a lot as well in events organised by other clubs. And some of these were quite serious races held at handicaps held at the track between sort of 1909 and 1911. And some of them were going back to the more gymkhana type things. She was actually quite good at driving with a blindfold on. There was an event where the driver had a blindfold on and they had to make their way. I'm not sure how big this field or area was, but there was a post in the middle and you had to drive and find the post, and the closest one weren't. And apparently she was very good at this. But yeah, she was a very skillful driver, and if she'd had more chances, and I think maybe if she'd been able to compete abroad, she would have done quite well. She was her public image was a bit of an odd one. You get people comparing her to an American jockey because she sat quite upright on her car and gripped the wheel rather than lying back, like you can see Christabel doing there. And Christabel actually had her skirt tied around her legs, which doesn't seem very good for operating the pedals or very safe in the case of a fire. But there were other women who were active at the track at this time. And some of them are really not well known at all. And Edith Patterson has become so obscure that we couldn't even find a high-res picture of her. Her car was an Imperia, which was built in 1909 or so. This is much later Imperia. But we just wanted a picture. But it just illustrates how easily women get lost in history. Edith Patterson set a speed record here in January 1909 in a British Imperia car. And she was one of the first to set an hour record. She was the first official female speed record holder. So she did 51 miles in an hour. It was an average speed of 51 miles an hour, which seems really, really quite pathetic now, but it was very impressive then, and it was not a powerful car at all. But although it was reported quite a lot in the papers, and there were pictures of her, it's just they're very blurry and they just come out as a sort of big splodge on the screen like that. She was famous at the time, but she just got forgotten very, very quickly, because this idea is like, oh yeah, motor racing's for men, Brooklands doesn't allow women to race, so let's just forget about Edith. I have looked into her a bit more and see if she had any other achievements, and it seems she did have another go at a motoring record. She took her Imperia car not long after her 51 miles an hour Brooklands exploits, and she attempted a record run from London to Edinburgh, which had been done as a trial before. I think Dorothy Levitt had a go at that record as well. It was meant to be a non-stop run, but unfortunately it took her 2 days and she did have to stop because she got lost in Doncaster. That was the end of her racing career. She had some fun. She got a bit of attention out of it. She got some publicity for the tyre company that was sponsoring her, but she didn't last long, and that's why she's just sort of been forgotten, and why we haven't even got any official photos of her, which I think maybe we should. But if we fast forward a few years, First World War's come and gone, and we're actually heading closer to the Second World War. In the 1930s, there was a big boom in women competing, and the BARC actually relaxed their rules completely, and you start getting mixed races that were organised by the main club. Obviously, other clubs had just done what they wanted for the whole time, and that's when we start getting superstars. Gwenda Stewart, who was also Gwenda Jansen and also Gwenda Hawkes. Doreen Evans, who was she was only 17 when she started, and she was very popular. Petre, who appeared in the film that was shown while we were waiting, actually racing against Gwenda Stewart for the ladies' outer circuit record, and Elsie Wisdom. all significant in their own ways. And 3 of them, at this point, Doreen wasn't married. Something else that when I first started researching this topic, about longer ago than I care to admit, I just assumed that it would be an unmarried women's occupation, that men wouldn't want their wives racing, and that's not true. 3 of these ladies were married, and they only actually took up motor racing after their marriages, and they were encouraged by their husbands. The story goes that Petre was such a crazy driver on the road that her husband Henry didn't want her destroying the gearbox on his Lagonda, so he bought her a little Wolseley Hornet to race. He didn't really race himself. He was a pilot, but he was a regular figure here. And Tommy Wisdom, who was married to Elsie, who was usually known as Bill, he persuaded her to race, even though she was terrified to start with. And Gwenda was encouraged to race by all 3 of her husbands. And there's actually an interesting link between her and the Edwardian ladies that we were talking about. In SF Edge, who was the big figure in promoting Dorothy Levitt, was actually one of Gwenda's backers at the beginning when she raced motorcycles. She raced a thing called a Nera car, which was more like I've looked into it, I just assumed it was a motorbike, but it's actually more like a scooter. It got this funny upright position and hub steering, and they were actually marketed at women. And SF Edge was behind all that. So he'd learnt that having a woman to promote your goods was a good thing. Gwenda's interesting because, let's find her, there she is. She held speed records on 2 wheels in the Nera car, and she was based at Montlhéry near Paris. And she was really well known for racing a 3-wheeler Morgan, and she held lots of speed records on 3 wheels, which I think some of them she still does, the 3-wheel records not really being attacked too much these days. And she also had speed records on 4 wheels. One of these was the Brooklands ladies record, which isn't actually that far off the perpetual circuit record of 144 miles an hour. I think it's 137, isn't it? And it ended up being a match race between Petre in the Delage, which had been raced by John Cobb, and Gwenda in the Derby Miller, which was a car of her own her and her husband's own design. There's actually someone here who's got a direct connection to Gwenda, so that was interesting talking about that earlier. But anyway, I digress. That was another thing that the press were all over. So these 2 women, are they going to race each other for a speed record at a race circuit? I mean, would you come across that in a newspaper now? I don't think so. It might get to sort of page 72 of Autosport or something like that. Or maybe get a piece on the One Show, but it wouldn't be major news. And there wouldn't be a huge prize put up either, but there was a cash prize that they were going for. Kay had the upper hand for quite a long time. They weren't directly on track against each other. It was a speed trial. But eventually it was Gwenda who triumphed by not very much and on the same day. So she walked away with a big cash prize and the bragging rights. And appearing in adverts and promoting tyres and all sorts of things. Petre was a really interesting one. She was actually very, very successful in her own way. She raced at Le Mans a few times. She won races in a Bugatti here. She won races in her Wolseley Hornet. She did win a race in the Delage as well, which is a massive, great 23.5 litre thing. I've actually sat in it its owner at the time was John T. Williamson, and he said when he bought the car, it had still got the wooden blocks on the pedals that she used so she could reach. And she must have had a different seat in it because she was 4'10". If you read reports at the time, she's between, I don't know, 4'8" and 5'2". It depended who she was talking to, but I think she was about 4'10". I'm 5'2", which is not much taller, and I could reach the pedals in the car quite easily. But then I found out that she invented something. She had a custom seat built for this car, and obviously all racing drivers have custom seats for their cars now, but she was one of the first, and it was a moulded seat that she made by sitting in a bucket of plaster of Paris to get like, a mould of her bum. And this is how racing seats, well, not with plaster of Paris, but this is the same principle that racing seats are made by now. And she was one of the first. She was, I've tried working out in my head whether she was very lucky or very unlucky. It's like the Yellowstone Ranger being hit by lightning 3 times and surviving. It's like, does that mean he's lucky or he's unlucky? You could say that about Kay as well. In 1936, she had an absolutely awful accident here practicing. She was part of the Austin Works team at the time. She was in a little side valve car. And Reg Parnell was racing for another team. And his car stalled, slid down the banking, took hers out. She rolled down the banking. There were head injuries. She was in the cottage hospital here with facial injuries. It wasn't expected she'd survive, and it was all very dramatic because she was a really loved character. I mean, she was quite pretty, which helped, and she was funny, and she'd got a bit of a way with men, but it looked like she was going to be no more. Reg Parnell had his licence taken away. She did eventually recover. She only raced a couple of times after that, and then she had the misfortune to be involved in an accident as a spectator as well, which meant she had another facial injury. I think she had a bit of facial paralysis for the rest of her life. So I don't know, surviving 2 accidents like that, I don't know whether that's lucky or unlucky. But she was always magnanimous. She went to the, it would have been the RSE, I think, the modern equivalent of the 1930s equivalent of MSUK, and said, well, it wasn't really his fault that he stalled and he didn't do it on purpose. Can you give Reg his licence back, please? And after the Second World War, he was actually one of Britain's Formula One drivers. So we have her to thank for that. And her comment on it is, well, if you race fast cars, there's always a risk that you're going to cop it. She was, unfortunately, after she retired from racing, she got a job as a journalist for the Daily Sketch, even though she claimed to anyone that listened that she couldn't spell and couldn't write at all, but she was pretty good. She was covering the RAC rally with Major Reggie Empson, and she was driving a press car, and he was with her, and they had yet another accident, and Reggie Empson actually died, which was horrible, and his family tried to sue Kay, and this being in France, and there was all sorts of legal nastiness, and things really went a bit wrong for her then. She left motorsport then, but she was still involved in the automotive industry. When they brought out the Mini in 1959, she was a colour consultant for Austin, so she was responsible for the interior fabrics and colourways, which, as well as being this very 1930s figure, very of her time, she was part of the swinging 60s as well, which I think is pretty cool. There she is again. I think this is 1937, and it's her first race back after her accident. I might be wrong, but I know there was a big fuss about it. She didn't race much after that. She did do one race, that's Gwenda again, at Crystal Palace, a ladies' race, and then she called it a day. When you're looking at the Brooklands ladies, it's always tempting to say, oh, which one was the best? And it's quite easy to have your favourites. You know, I've always got a soft spot for Kay, just because it was her car that I came across first, and she's short like me, and she's a journalist like me, and I just feel a sort of fellow feeling for her. But probably in terms of success on track, this beautiful one was probably better. This is Elsie Wisdom, always known as Bill. I'm not entirely sure why. I think her brother gave her that name when she was a child. This is a picture of her doing her best impression of Joan Crawford. She always wore black racing overalls because they didn't show dirt, and she liked to look amazing when she was in a car. And when you've got the kind of face that is the sort of face that you want in the time period that you're young, why wouldn't you? Her biggest achievement was the Brooklands BRDC 500-mile race in 1932. And her and an Australian driver called Joan Richmond actually won. They were up against, they were in a Riley, and they were up against much faster cars. So they knew that it was a long race, and they just had to pace themselves. It was really modern tactics of the kind that you get in endurance racing now. And they knew that if they just kept putting the laps in and not stressing the car too much, they'd just be able to keep on and keep on and keep on, even though they weren't the fastest on the track. It rained, which helped them. Something I have noticed is that female drivers tend to be quite good on wet tracks. I don't know why that is, and it's not all of them, but they certainly made the most of a wet track. And they won. This was the first major race win. There's Joan there. Joan, she was a bit, inconsistent. She had some odd car choices. She had this ex-Malcolm Campbell Ballo that never finished anything. She was actually a really good rally driver, and at that time, obviously, it wasn't just a case of, for the Monte Carlo rally, at least, it wasn't just a case of turning up at Monte Carlo, doing a few stages, who's the quickest, let's go home. You had to rally from a number of points around the world. And Joan Richmond chose Australia. With her friend Jean Robertson, she drove overland in a Riley from Australia, obviously not over the sea, she went on a ship for that, to Monte Carlo to participate in the rally there. And she finished as well. Not one to do anything by halves. She could have just taken a steamer or maybe even taken an aeroplane for part of the journey at that point. So no, I should just drive there. I've never been able to prove this, but I think Joan got her mechanical nous from training with a woman called Alice Anderson, who had a women-only garage and sort of mechanics training school. There's a book written about her that I've never managed to get hold of because it's not been published in this country. But she was quite a well-known figure of the time, and she opened this garage, and to start with it was just a garage that employed women, and then she started training female mechanics, and quite a lot of them, well, some of them anyway, did get involved in motorsport, and I think Joan was one of them. Alice herself never actually raced, and something really quite awful happened to her. I don't think she was even 30, and she was found shot in the head in her workshop, and it was judged to be an accident, which was quite tragic. We've got the big stars, and we've got little stars, like Edith Patterson, and we've got the very little stars like Ida Alwyn here. Alwyn. Not sure how she pronounced it, she's not here to help me. And this picture is usually captioned, female mechanic, Miss J. Alwyn at Brooklands in 1931 working on an Austin. She's got goggles on, so it looked to me like, she's going to race. So I had a bit of a poke around, and there were newspaper reports at the time of a woman in an Austin who raced at Brooklands in October, called Ida Alwyn. And this happens a lot, and I think it's just because someone's mistaken someone's handwriting, got an I mixed up with a J, so Miss J. Alwyn and Ida Alwyn have become two different people, and they're actually one and the same. Ida, unfortunately, God bless her soul, had the shortest career, I think, of any racing driver, not just that I'm going to talk about, but of any at all. She doesn't appear in Bill Body's history because she never actually got to an official qualifying session. She practiced in this car here that she's working on very intently for a race that was won by Faye Taylor. There was actually a film of it showing before I was speaking. During practice, she lost control of her car and went into a roped enclosure and nearly cut her own head off. And she was okay. The papers loved it. It was like, girl racer nearly cuts her own head off. But we never see her again. It was enough to put her off completely, I think. I've never found any evidence that she tried again. And she didn't try and qualify, and she's just sort of went home and hid in embarrassment, I think. But these are the stories that go missing. And other stories sort of pop up to explain them, that she was someone's mechanic, but she was actually working on her own car, trying not to get her head cut off by a bit of rope. And then, as well as little tiny stories, and Kay Petre's story is crazy enough, someone I've been researching quite a lot is Mrs. A.C. Lace, who is this glamorous blonde here, posing in the pits, just down here somewhere. She raced a few different cars. She first appears as a rally driver, and she was in a sister car of Marcus. Is it Marin? I never know how to say this. Marindaz. Marindaz? Does anyone know? Marindaz. Him. And they seem to be quite pally. And I've looked into Mr. Marindaz a bit, and he was a bigamist, basically. He had two wives, and just to confuse everyone, they were both called Dorothy, and one of them was another racer called Dorothy Summers, and I have a suspicion that Mrs. Lace was one of his conquests. It didn't seem to last very long, though, but that was how she rolled. She called herself Mrs. A.C. Lace while she was out racing at Talbot with Mr. A.C. Lace, but she was never married to him. I've actually been in contact with, I think, what relation is she? Cousin once removed, I think. Her mum was, well, Phoebe was her actual birth name. She went by many different names. And she was from the Isle of Man, and she met Mr. Lace at a race on the Isle of Man and fell madly in love with him. I think we can say euphemistically, when the attraction was a bit baser than that, and ran off with him. And they were together for a while until that all fell apart, and they were both declared bankrupt, I think, the same year. Her biggest achievement was 1937. She raced against Kay Petre at Crystal Palace in a ladies' race, and she actually won. But the most interesting thing about her, she was actually a career criminal. She was awful. I mean, even the lady that I spoke to, who was related to her, said that her mum said she was awful. At one point, she had 3 husbands at the same time. She married Mr. McQueen. She never divorced him, and she was married to other people, sometimes concurrently, sometimes she divorced. If she wanted to move on, she normally just emigrated to another country and pretended to be a widow. As far as I know, she never actually killed anybody, but I am being a bit flippant, but researching it, I wouldn't be surprised if she had. There's all sorts of reports that her and one of her husbands stole the children's nanny's life savings. Her husband at the time, Brian Carberry, also, I think he ended up in jail for fencing a Bristol bowfighter to, I think, the Canadian government. He was dodgy, but only as dodgy as her. That fell apart. They had 2 sons who ended up being brought up by their grandparents. And Mrs. Lace then emigrated to South Africa, where she spoke to papers and said she'd raced at Le Mans. She said she wasn't a racing driver anymore. She'd moved on from that. She had at least 1 husband over there. She started knocking years off her age. I think by the time she died, she was 24 years younger than she actually was. And she changed her name a couple of times. Once she went by the name Babette for most of the rest of her life. And her scam over there was, she was a boxing promoter. And considering this is South Africa in the 50s, or early 60s, I think, and they were organising black versus white boxing bouts, which obviously there was something really icky about that. Nobody got paid. Someone disappeared with all the money. We can guess. We don't know who it was. We can guess who it was. She ended up back in the UK. She never reconciled with her sons, and ended up working in this, about 1971, I think, working as a barmaid in a pub. She was described as no fixed abode. And doing her usual thing, she decided she was going to run off with the guy who owned the pub. She'd already got form for rinsing out the tills at pubs and just disappearing. So she'd done that, run off with the pub's owner. His estranged wife gave evidence because they jumped in his Daimler Sovereign, I think it was in Hemel Hempstead, and ended up having a fatal accident. And that's when the story starts to unfold a bit, because she'd got, it was an immunisation card in the name of Babette Dale Lace, and it must have taken quite a lot of brain work to work out who that was, because they didn't have computers or anything like that. And there's lots of searching and carding indexes. Like, there's no such person as Babette Dale Lace. And eventually they found out who she was. She'd been passing herself off as a widow. The day after she died, her South African husband filed for divorce from her. So I think she was about 60-something, but she was passing herself off as 40-something. And she was a tricky character. We've got others as well who weren't really who they claimed to be. And this is Dorothy Patton, who did race a bit. This is a Dalmat Peugeot that she raced with her husband, Rainer Dorndorf. She was pretty good. She was probably better in rallies. She was towards the end of the 30s. This car came out for the RAC, the Monte Carlo rally. She raced it on track a bit. She's another one that there was actually no such person as Dorothy Patton. We've worked out who she was, pretty much, and she was really unusual in that she was actually a working class girl who'd somehow come into some money. We don't know how. There's a number of ways she could have come into some money. But at some point when she was in her early teens, she was sent to, it was a training college for domestic servants, which, having looked into it, that could have actually been a girl's borstal. She raced at Brooklands as Dorothy Patton. She was very popular with men. She's described as, like many of the ladies talking about tonight, having a way with men. And then she was married to Rainer Dorndorf, and she suddenly started calling herself Baroness von Dorndorf or Countess von Dorndorf. Another thing I've looked into, Rainer von Dorndorf never used a title, and as far as I know, didn't have one. She was still active after the war. She raced at Goodwood a bit as Dorothy, or either Patton or von Dorndorf. She, talking to the press, she killed Rainer off in 1937 and said that he'd been killed in a hunting accident when he was actually still alive and he outlived her. There's been all sorts of odd rumours about Dorothy as well, that she had a body double for photos. I really don't understand that. There's side-by-side pictures where you look, something does look a bit different, and it could be that she had a daughter that she didn't acknowledge, or I just think she was an early recipient of her facelift. I haven't got the pictures because they're only blurry scans from a magazine, but she's another one this sort of mystique follows around. It's something I really like about well, not just women, but earlier racing drivers. They weren't these athletes. They were personalities and people with stories. Of course, not everything was about bigamy and body doubles and crazy accidents. There were some really serious competitors at the time. And this is Odette Seco, who still holds the record for the highest finish at Le Mans for a woman. She was fourth in 1932 with Jean Zabipard, and in 1930, her and another lady called Marguerite Mareuse finished 7th in an Alfa Romeo, and that was the highest finish for an all-female team, and I think it still is. So although she was very personable and very pretty, it wasn't just personality-led. There were some very serious, very good racers, and Odette was also involved in rallies, although she had got her start in things like the Journée Féminine d'Automobiles, which was organised at Montlhéry, which was a all-female racing jamboree. Le Mans has actually been quite a fruitful hunting ground for women. If I was to ask maybe a less well-read audience, what year do you think the most women entered Le Mans? I don't know, someone like my mum wouldn't say 1935, and that's actually true. Which I think it's crazy that it's nearly 90 years ago that 10 women were on the track at Le Mans, and we've not really been near it for quite a long time. This is going back into sort of personality-led things and also into legends, but 1935, MG had a 3-car, 6-girl team run by Sir George Easton. It was Margaret Allen and Colleen Eaton, Joan Richmond, who we've also talked about, and Evelyn Gordon-Simpson, Doreen Evans and Barbara Skinner. They finished, I think, 24th, 25th and 26th. And they're quite often referred to now as the Dancing Daughters, and that was, I think it was the name of a radio programme of the time, but at the time, if you look at reports from 1935, nobody called them that. They were George's young ladies, or Mr. Easton's young ladies, or Captain Easton's young ladies. But it was a serious attempt. There were 3 cars. There was quite a financial commitment, and they all finished, and they all tried. Right, moving into more modern motorsport now, we've shunted forward. There's all sorts of stories that I could have told, but I haven't got time for all of them. I'd be talking for about 5 hours at least, and everyone will fall asleep. But Janet Guthrie is a story that sticks out. She was the first woman to qualify for the Indianapolis 500 in 1976. And she'd been quite a successful sports car racer. She was absolute serious of the series. She was an engineer. She's a nuclear physicist. She had come quite close to getting onto the astronaut training program if they'd have let women on. She had the right, if you've read that Tom Wolfe book about astronauts, she had the right stuff. But to really hit the big time, it was really hard to be taken seriously, especially in America, because women weren't even allowed in the pit lane at Indianapolis. I don't know when that rule came in, because I think very early on it wasn't there. But it's like, oh no, women are bad luck, we don't want them. Then the owner of Charlotte Motor Speedway, Humpy Wheeler, thought it'd be a really, really good idea to have a woman race, and he kind of, he did get her involved in NASCAR eventually, but he found a team that was willing to run a Roller Volstedt's team. And to start with, there was just so much opposition to her. There were even fans who came to the signing session and brought porn magazines for her to, shove them in front of her face to sign. There was this really weird story about a track marshal waving a rubber chicken at her. I don't know what he was trying to achieve with that, but eventually he wrote a nice message on it and gave it to her because she managed to prove everybody wrong. It took her a couple of attempts to qualify, but for a long time she was the highest finishing woman at Indy when she was 9th in 1977, and that was doubly impressive considering that she was driving with a broken wrist on her gear-changing arm. I think James Hunt did the same, not at Indy, but raced in a Grand Prix with a broken wrist, so it must be a racing driver thing, but she managed it. Humpy Wheeler then got her involved in NASCAR, which was even more resistant. It was like, no, we're for good old boys, we don't want girls here, even though when that first started in the late 1940s, there were quite a few women involved. There was Ethel Flott Mobley and Sarah Christian, Louise Smith, and there were a few, and there was actually an all-female NASCAR race organised by Bill France himself. So again, it was one of those situations where when something starts, like, right, who's it for? Who does it belong to? And it was soon decided, it's like, no, not girls. Good old boys, rum runners. So in comes Janet Guthrie, who is not only a woman, she is a highly educated woman. She's from New York. She's into classical music and fine dining and French fashion. She's not NASCAR. And to start with, they didn't even want to let her in the pit lane, but it's like, well, how's she going to race if she doesn't go in the pit lane? And to finance her car, Humpy Wheeler got together with a woman he knew from the Charlotte Chamber of Commerce, I think, Linda Ferrari, who knew absolutely nothing about motor racing, but just thought this was a brilliant idea. It's like, come on, let's go for it. So she was car entrant, she financed the whole thing, and she owned all the team kit. And I can't remember what year it was, but I know Janet Guthrie still holds the record for the highest female finish in NASCAR. She was, the equivalent of a cup race, she was 4th. Not long after, we get this wonderful lady here, who was also brought in as a gimmick by Audi in 1981. So we've got this new car and we've got this new technology. It's four-wheel drive, and we're pushing things forward. We're pushing the rules a bit because we know that they're going to change quite soon. I know, let's get a girl to drive it. So Michelle she's still quite frank about that now. It's like, yeah, they brought me in because it was for publicity. But she was actually really good. Michele Mouton, as everyone knows, she won 4 World Championship rallies in 1981 and 1982. She was the first driver to win a rally for Audi and in a 4-wheel drive car, and she was effectively the first driver to win in a Group B car. It was a San Remo rally in 1981. So all these records belong to her, and she's a Trivial Pursuit question now. They won't be taken away from her. But again, she wasn't plucked from nowhere. Like, you could tell the story like that. If it was a film, they probably would. It's like, Michelle has just done a few treasure hunt type rallies with her dad, when really she'd been winning all over Europe for quite a long time. And she was, for Fiat, she rallied a Porsche. She's pretty quick in a Porsche. She also raced at Le Mans and won her class one year with an all-female team. But she wasn't at the sort of early 70s when she got going. This was the backdrop. This is Team Aseptigil, and they were brought in as a gimmick. This was Bob Neyret, who was a French rally driver and French dentist, who had the rights to Aseptigil toothpaste. And like you do, he decided, like, I'm going to promote my new toothpaste brand by getting women to drive rally cars. So he got these 3 Alpine Renault A110s, A110s? I'm never sure how you say that. But anyway, there were 3 of them in 1971, and he got six women to drive them. I mean, he could have. One of them was Claudine Trautmann, who had been French champion before and was coming to the end of her career, so she was there to sort of anchor the team. But he could have been really cynical and asked Miss France to take part, and I don't know, actresses or people like that. But he was actually quite canny. He knew that the French rally scene at the time was all about mountains and the stages in the south of France. So he recruited the rest of his drivers from ski resorts. They were the girls that had worked as ski instructors and chalet girls. So they were good at driving on snow, driving on narrow mountain paths. And it did actually work. I mean, there was a bit of cynicism in there. To start with, there were identical blonde twins, which I think are the two girls on the far right, Mary O'Deal and Anne-Marie Davine. Anne-Marie didn't last very long. But again, it proved successful. They weren't just sort of popsies in pink cars jumping up going, girl power, yay, inspiration. It was, there was a rotating roster of drivers, and Christine Dacremont, who was a very good rally driver, also a very good sports car driver who competed at Le Mans quite a few times. She won rallies. I think it was actually in the Alpine A310. And this project went on for years. They had a car at Le Mans, which was driven by Lella Lombardi, of all people. They had a hill climb car, a little single-seater that Marianne Herpfner drove. And the last gasp of it was in 1983, where they had a series of national female teams for the Monte Carlo Rally in Alpha Suds. I think there were about 12 of them, but most of them didn't qualify. And then just after that, there are other ways of using women as promotional tools within motorsport. And John Webb, of course, who died last year, who's ran Brands Hatch for many years, someone who should remain nameless who worked for him said that he loved a woman in a car. So yeah, if there's a girl out there, get her in a car, get her in front of the press. I don't care if she's crap. And he championed the careers of quite a lot of women. We've got Davina Galitza there, and she was one of two drivers who ended up taking a chance at Formula One thanks to John Webb. So it was all about promotion, but he really did put his money where his mouth is, which a lot of people won't do that anymore. Davina had been a downhill skier. I think that if she'd have started her motorsport career a bit earlier, as opposed to in her early 30s, she would have been the real thing. She was pretty good in the Group 7 Championship. She was a really good Sports 2000 racer. She was very successful in truck racing. She's absolutely as hard as nails. I mean, in the early 90s, she came back to the ski team. But she got her start with John Webb because he'd been organising celebrity races, and there was a couple of sports-themed ones. And Davina and Gina Hathorn, who was also a skier, got invited to take part, and Davina was really, really good. So it's like, come on, and had her driving a Formula Ford 2000 to start with as well. And then it ended up with a tyre test, and she ended up trying to qualify a battered old Surtees for 1976 British Grand Prix, which is the first time that two women tried to qualify, Lella Lombardi being the other one. Fortunately, neither of them qualified. He was also pretty instrumental in bringing Desiree Wilson to the fore. Again, got her in on a tyre test, got her in with RAM Racing for the British Grand Prix, but that all went very, very wrong. As they'd got this car, a Williams, and Desi had a bit of a practice in it with ground effects on it, so it got the sliding, right way around. It didn't have ground effects on it, so she'd got her head around how this car worked. Then they decided the night before the race that the car needed ground effects, and they fitted sliding skirts on it, which I don't think even worked properly. She couldn't control the car. 1980 British Grand Prix, the only person slower than her was Joachim Mass, who was also driving a shed. But a year after, she did really well at Le Mans. She was with Alain de Cadenet, sadly also no longer with us, as of quite recently. And they were 9th in his own prototype. But of course, this being John Webb and this being about promotion, there were also some very silly things that happened. It's more of the lighter side of women's participation. At the same time as Davina, he brought in Anne Moore, who'd been a show jumper. She won an Olympic medal in 1972. And he had her in a Formula Ford 2000. And her excuse for not, I think her career lasted 6 races, which is it's more impressive than Ida Alwyn, but it's still not. Said, oh, I haven't really got time to keep it up. Apparently, she'd really not been very quick. And I can't remember what year it was, but the craziest, well, there was lots of crazy things, like having the Bay City Rollers play a gig at Mallory Park and having hordes of teenage girls crossing the track during a Formula Ford race and swimming in the ponds to get across to them. But not quite that crazy, but crazy still. He pioneered the motorsport triathlon. So there was a team of female drivers who were part of his sponsored team. They got called the Charm School. And Lella Lombardi was actually one of them. They were in Ford Escorts, and they did, I think it was 3 laps of the track, then passed the baton over to a runner, and they were all men. And one of them was Dave Bedford, who is the hairy man that the 118 runners were based on. And they did, I think it was a lap of the track, no, half a lap. And then there was a cyclist to complete the triathlon, and they did a lap of the track, I think. It only happened once. I think it ended up taking rather a long time, but there were some really high-profile people involved in it, and it got in the likes of The Sun, and it was just a way of getting female drivers in front of people, which it's a sense of fun that I think's gone missing from motorsport a bit in general in the past few years. I think we just need a few more women. We'd brighten things up, and not quite up to the present day, being as W Series imploded quite spectacularly last year in a bit of a mess of financial mismanagement, which is not that uncommon in motorsport. We should be a little bit charitable, maybe. But is the future now? Is it all female? I'd like to think that it isn't. This was one of the training camps for. It was, yeah, I think it was W Series. So that looks like Sophia Flörsch on the left, and she didn't take part. But never mind. That's what we're demonstrating. And instead of it being crazy, there was no bigamy. There was no racing 3-wheelers or getting involved in motor triathlons with hairy men and cyclists. It was all very controlled and very polite. I wasn't really a fan. I don't know, it's just getting into what the future of motorsport is. And I like to think that there are women who aren't sort of polite and just waiting for people to give them opportunities. They're going out and grabbing them with dodgy marriages and toothpaste adverts. And that's the big thing that I took away from writing the book, just how fabulous these stories were, how they needed to be written down and kept somewhere. It's a bit of a, I don't know, is it a sad or a happy? It's like, was Kay Petre lucky or unlucky? Is this sad or happy? I don't know. But W Series is no more. We've got F1 Academy that's well, quite similar. But yeah, I'd just like to finish by, it's like we really need to keep hold of these stories of these magnificent women in their speed machines, because we might not get some more in the future. I'd like to think we will, though. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel. For any of you who don't know me, I'm the Harry Sherrod referred to by Fiona earlier. You've grabbed your notebook there, but it's a little bit early to do that, Rachel, because we could have some questions for you.
Okay.
So if you just stay where you are, I'm not going to let you escape just yet.
I can answer questions from a notebook in my hand.
So I think we've got a question here.
I'm sorry, I'm a 75-year-old boss. I apologise in advance. But my grandmother married my grandfather Alfred Angel in June 1914. Mrs. Angel bought her first car in July 1914. Mm-hmm. My mother was born 9 months after that. And my mother said she drove a borrowed Bugatti here in Junior Brooklands, and she drove into the pits, took off her leather flying helmet, and heard a loud voice say, "Good God, it's a bloody woman."
What was her name?
She claimed she rode in the first point-to-point ladies' race over island fences, and as she went down to the start, she heard an old farmer say, "These silly bitches are going to break their necks." Anyway, some years ago, the Bugatti Club were at Newmarket races, and you were talking about fun. And my mother tried to engage some of the owners there, and they didn't want to talk to an old woman. And as we walked away, she said, "Huh, they're not as much fun as the pre-war Bugatti people." and before you cut me off, may I just say one final story? The sort of person she was, 50 years ago, she was driving from the Horse of the Year show up the A1 on a horribly foggy night. And I was following in my little Fiat 500 a Bath. A man overtook me, overtook the horse trailer, crashed into the side of my mother's Austin 4x4. The door was, by her right leg, was about 6 inches wide. And so we were standing on the A1 on a foggy night with the man ranting that she pulled out in front of him. And my mother, in this very cool and frosty voice, said, "Is that lady with you your wife?" Immediately the man became very compliant and paid and fetched the whole thing up. And finally, her sister, at a great age, took the advanced driving test and failed because she drove too fast along the country roads.
What was her name? What was her name? She sounds fabulous.
Okay, got a question here for Gareth.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
In my lifetime, following motorsport, probably 40-odd years, Michele Mouton stands out as the exceptional female driver of any sport, any form of motorsport. Do you think she was the best ever, or do you have any other thoughts on that?
I don't think you can argue with her being the best ever. In terms of results, I know I wrote something for Autosport Online. They asked me to put like the 10 best female drivers, and to start with that, I wanted to bring in Kay, or I don't know, to bring in ones from around the world. But it's like, it's just got to be Michele. She's got 4 wins in a major global series. I don't think any other woman has got that. If you look at the all-time list, she's next to Francois Delacour, and he's known as being great, so I think she should be too.
Okay. Any other questions? Got one right up at the front here, Lorraine.
Thank you for an amazing presentation tonight.
Thank you.
And all the knowledge you have in your head. My question is, if you had the opportunity to have lunch and do an in-depth interview as a journalist, both a historical or a more modern lady, who would you pick and why?
Oh, that's a good question. It's probably going to have to be Kay, just because, I don't know, there's so many things I want to ask her about just her life, and there was all sorts of other stuff that I could have. She emigrated from Canada. She had a failed marriage at a young age, but she just sort of got up and carried on. She got into motor racing almost on a whim, because her husband didn't want her to break a car, and she just had personality and spark. But I don't know, I'd like to have lunch with lots of them. Dorothy Levitt as well. I'd just like to say, Dorothy, look, I've got the tape recorder off. Can you please tell me what on earth is going on? Maybe speaking, when she died in 1922, she died when she was very young, but maybe if I could talk to her in, I don't know, 1914 or something like that. It's like, Dorothy, why did you stop? You're brilliant.
Yep. Interesting question, thank you. Any other questions? Got one just here in the front row. Oh, you go, thanks.
With an interest in aviation as well, Diana Bonato Walker.
Oh, yeah.
Any stories on her at all?
I don't know a huge amount about her. She did do a little bit of racing, I think. I think it was her that took part in the guys' gala here. And there was a Mrs. Barnato that, because of the year it was, I've not been able to work out which Mrs. Barnato it was. There were a few. But yeah, she was definitely a very interesting character, wasn't she? She held an airspeed record, didn't she? Yeah. Mm. Yeah, the ATA, they are fascinating. I've not looked that much into aviation. I have written a little bit about the Daily Mail air race, but it's definitely something, there's a crossover. Oh, it's another one just here.
Oh, another question just here.
Hello, yes. I'd just like to ask, why do you think more women don't want to go into motor racing?
It's a difficult question because obviously women are 51% of the population and there are going to be loads of different reasons. Partly it's because we're socialised to be a bit more risk averse. We're socialised to not be interested in cars. I know I was working somewhere, I was actually staying at someone's house, and their 4-year-old daughter is really into fire engines at the moment, and that stood out as being unusual when, if she was a boy, it would just be normal, but she's absolutely obsessed with fire engines. It's like, oh my God, that's really weird. But it isn't really. They're colourful, they make noise. But yeah, partly it's a money thing as well. If we take women as a whole across the globe, we tend to not quite have as much money, and it's a childhood thing. Families where there's motorsports, sometimes the girls get involved, but I've noticed quite often girls do horses with their mum, boys do cars with their dad. Until that changes, I don't know how we change it, because if girls don't want to do it, they don't want to do it.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions? Okay, I'll have one last question just over here in the middle, Lorraine, and then I think we'll wrap up with this question.
Just to follow on from that, I think it's actually interesting to see why some of the female racers have been so successful and the reason that they have competed. I'm lucky, I've known an awful lot of them. Patsy Burt, very successful hill climb champion.
Oh yeah.
Maggie Blankston, and I remember talking to them, Davina Galitza. All of them said the same thing. They had absolutely no interest in ladies' awards. They wanted to win. And motorsport is just about the only sport where male and female can compete equally, and that was the attraction for them.
Mm.
Yeah, you're certainly strongly of that opinion as well, Rachel.
Yeah.
Okay, a big hand please for Rachel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, a couple of other things. If you're bought a raffle ticket tonight, you could be lucky enough to win one of Rachel's books. That was one of the prizes in the raffle tonight. Alternatively, you would have to buy them on Amazon. Rachel hasn't bought a supply with her tonight, unfortunately, but they are available directly from Pen and Sword, the publisher, or Amazon, or presumably certain other sources as well.
Yeah, Waterstones sell online. Pen and Sword, I think, I shouldn't really say this, but I think I get a slightly bigger cut if you buy from Pen and Sword direct. Yeah. And they quite often do have good deals on.
Yes, I think Amazon take 40% or something. It's pretty horrific, isn't it? Yeah. So thank you all very much indeed for coming. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.